This is update for January 16, 2023, days 327 of the war and of the date update. I'm going to start with general or strategic topics, and then we're going to switch to Ukraine as always. So let's start today with, China. China export went down by 9.9% year on year in December. That's, I would say, really bad number. And the import went down by 7.5%. So export is basically what China sold to the world, and import is what China brought from the world. The key point is that drop in 9.9 in export is, I would say, horrible number, and import as well, but that kind of follows the export. And what this really means is that the world economy is not doing well at all. And we definitely going through what's called de-globalization. And it looks like this process is accelerating. In terms of China itself, if you compare, export versus import, you see that import went down by a smaller number. That's also bad on top of just the bad number that export went down, because what this really means is the export is becoming less profitable. So in other words, they have to cut prices, they have to fight for the customer by reducing prices, reducing as a result profits, and reducing incentives. So as a whole, that's really for the business, any business, it's a bad sign, bad situation. Going back to that deglobalization, I mentioned that yesterday that Chinese representatives and Russians are not there, oligarchs. From the West, key globalization figures are not there either. One is Klaus Schwab, and the other one is George Soros. So this really means that Davos is essentially dead at this point, and the trend has firmly changed, and it's accelerating, and it's going to create a lot of problems around the world, because the world was optimized to function as one on economic level. I'm not talking about the optimization by Klaus Schwab and George Soros. Those optimizations are far from economy. That's more about control and dictatorship. But if we remove that sort of negative aspect of it that those two people were trying to introduce, it was net positive for everybody. Even some people are, negative. They may have lost jobs, but as a whole, every society more or less was gaining, because it allowed to produce everything at the lowest price possible at that time. Now that sort of engine of prosperity is destroyed, broken, and we're going to be seeing inflation around the world, especially in the West. Because not only this is the problem, but also the policies in all countries in the West of the governments are, throwing more gasoline into the fire with their actions. And so situation is going to worsen economically. Another point on China, real estate prices continue going down 0.2% in December. So basically implosion of Chinese real estate continues. And all of those, if you remember, about 2 months ago, I was talking about, or maybe 3, that Chinese government was basically pumping money into real estate market through 5 government-controlled banks, or partially. Essentially, they have control. Maybe they don't have, even if it's not 51, if it's 49, effectively government control. So they were pumping money in a hope to stem that collapse, and they, the force that they are facing is much larger than the government, because that's economy, and economy can destroy any government, which is what is happening, and that's going back to all of these concerns about China potentially invading Taiwan is this is exactly the concern, that they will do it out of economic reasons, not because they needed to do it military wise or even for any other reasons, but because they have problems inside of the country and they need to release that negative energy somewhere. Because you may have seen that layoffs starting in China at large factories, and this is the sort of starting trend in China. As the de-globalization is going to worsen, the situation there is going to get worse. You have a army of unemployed people. Regular army cannot control it, police cannot control it. What are you going to do? The best way to keep them busy, and one of the options is to invade something to basically keep them busy and kind of kill them. This is a very sort of pragmatic approach, but this is probably what's going on in the heads of the Chinese political leadership. Also, now let's switch a little bit to Russia. So just to understand how uncomparable export natural gas to for Russia to China is relative to Europe. So Russia sold 15 billion cubic meters of natural gas to China in 2022. That's just so you can contrast it with 200 to Europe, and the prices to China are somewhere under $200 per thousand cubic meters. To Europe, it used to be in 400-500. So you can see the margin is clearly not there. Russia need to invest into very expensive infrastructure, specifically what I mean pipelines. They're extremely long, and that makes this whole exporting of Russian natural gas to China is essentially road to nowhere. That's the best way to describe it. Just to keep themselves busy, essentially. You just work to keep yourself busy. The better ways would be to actually turn that into fertilizer, turn into the more value-added products that you can do, such as plastics from natural gas and so on. But at the same time, Russia does not have technology, and so it's kind of too late to do any of those things. So essentially, what I want to say is this export basically natural gas as a source of revenue is essentially done and dead for Russia as a system. You can say Russian government, but I would say more largely for the Russia and as a system. Then let's actually switch to Russian crude oil. The export of crude oil rebounded in January. That's because Russia was offering steep discounts to get cash, and the average price, I believe the Russian Minister of Finance was reporting like $48 per barrel, plus minus like maybe I missed $1 or something. But in the grand scheme of things, it's not relevant. The point is, it's 48. It's much less than what Russian government needs, which is like about 70 to keep the budget in good shape and to finance the war. So, but it's still enough money to continue. It's tight, but it's sort of doable with this tightness. And again, Russia exports mostly to China, India, some Turkey. The way it works is as I discussed many times, is they basically sell mostly to very small, tiny refineries that don't care about the sanctions. And so that's how it works. Then the way it works next is that China and India refine it and sell it as Indian and Chinese, let's say, diesel fuel or gasoline or jet fuel or whatever. And so in that way, Latvia, which is a country up north of Belarus and actively supporting Ukraine, otherwise excellent place and everything, but they proudly imported diesel fuel from China. So now you understand what kind of diesel fuel they were importing. And that this is the again, talking about the sanctions that don't make sense. This brings obviously more inflation because you need to, bring crude oil on one side of the world, completely opposite from Latvia and Russia. I mean, European Russia, part of the Russia, and then bring it back as refined products. So you're just increasing the cost of logistics significantly. And so just that's the small tiny example of why globalization is falling apart and how it's falling apart. This is not all sort of examples. There's many more, but just give you like sort of like, okay, how it is on the ground, right? Then there are actually, I forgot to mention yesterday, there were news that Russia is going to be supplying Su-35 fighters to Iran. So that's obviously the payback for the drones that Russia was receiving. And so sort of kind of like no surprise there. I guess Israel is probably will be very concerned. And at the same time, US now is considering attack on Iran, giving this whole situation that Iran is getting more advanced weapon systems and really becoming much more dangerous with all of that. So this is just kind of like very logical sort of flow of this development of the situation there. Sort of no surprises. Now let's switch to Ukraine. The energy distribution system is still functioning in coma, in war situation, and prior to this recent attack, since wars. At the same time, it still functions as one system. It did not disintegrate into these isolated islands that I mentioned before. But situation, I would say, unbearable unless you live outside of the city and you sort of what's called off the grid. Then you can survive. Still, not fun, but you can live there for as long as you want. So now let's actually jump to the walks through the front line, and we're gonna do it in a clockwise fashion as we always do, starting from very north, and then gonna go down south. So the situation along the state border is somewhat more elevated, mostly due to Ukrainian attacks, but nothing sort of major, no major Russian attack or Ukrainian attack along the state border is sort of imminent or even coming or happening anytime soon. Now let's jump to the North Lugansk front line. Things were actually surprisingly quiet, more or less along the entire front line. Meaning by quiet, I mean there's no offensives, right? There's always artillery fire, there's always reconnaissance group probing each other, and those things never stop everywhere, including Zaporizhzhia front line, because sometimes maybe people get impression it's just quiet, as they say, all quiet on the Western Front. I still highly recommend that movie. If you haven't watched it, please do watch. It's the best movie I would say I've seen in a long time. So going back to all of this, so things here in balance more or less for both sides. Remains to be seen if this is going to be area where the Russian side will launch offensive. Hard to predict at this point. Let's say too early. Now let's move to North Donbass, where it's the war situation for Ukrainian side. So Wagner mercenaries continuing their attacks. They managed to actually gain control over that railroad station, Sil or Salt. So now they control one sort of another piece of the town. They effectively control the town, but just they came much closer to sort of legally say, hey, we control the town. But from all intents and purposes, the town has been lost probably 5 days ago, 6 days ago. But the point is that that railroad station could pose sort of natural defensive line, and it's being lost, and it's not really good sign um, about the health of the or morale on the Ukrainian side and what's going on there. That's I would say totally not good sign. At the same time, the salt mine number 7 still in Ukrainian hands, but that's the only remaining sort of asset that's somehow attached to Soledar. Otherwise, the town is cleanly and sort of perfectly lost to Russian troops. And they continue their push west, as you can see here. That's essentially a very logical next step. And there's no reason why Wagner mercenaries will not repeat what they did in Soledar. Just a question of time, because there are no changes on the Ukrainian side. Wagner mercenaries were not sort of incorporated so far into Russian army, so the things will continue sort of operate the way they used to. Let's just look a little bit south of Bakhmut. Things are more or less sort of similar. Wagner mercenaries continuing their attacks. Basically, they want to get out of Klishchiivka and into this operating area, and then basically move towards Ivanivsk. That would be a pretty bad development for Ukrainian troops. So remains to be seen. This is one of the main focuses of the Wagner mercenaries at this point in time. Then let's actually look at central Donbass front line, and we can even compare and contrast. So as you can see, there's quite a bit of activity right now here by Russian army, and yesterday there was, but I can almost guarantee you nothing will happen out of all of this. A lot of activity, a lot of attacks and all of that. For the most part, they probably will fail. And this is, again, to compare and contrast with Wagner mercenaries, where there is effectiveness, there are results, there are dead people, obviously. No question about that. They pay price, but what they get is more than what they pay. And so that means that that's profitable. This is not the case with the regular Russian army. It's bogged down, and as a whole, it's not capable of much relative to Ukrainian army. So essentially, there is a parity there, and basically, as I said yesterday, if Wagner mercenaries are taking out of the front line, essentially everything will stop and will turn into total positional war, similar to World War One. Let's put this. I'm not going to pick the year, whatever, 1916, 1917, whatever you want to pick. But essentially, the only hope for Russian side is this Wagner mercenaries. And the only hope for Ukrainian side is something happens to Wagner mercenaries, so they don't exist the way they are anymore as an organization. But so far they're still sort of around. There is no indication that they will be incorporated into Russian army, but there is definitely huge pressure. At the same time, I think Russian president is very cognizant that by incorporating Wagner mercenaries, he will destroy them, and then he will destroy the only opportunity to sort of show some kind of progress in Ukraine to their internal audience, because propaganda in Russia works, and it needs to show results. And if there are no results, eventually the question will be towards the Tsar. and there is a good saying in Russia: okay, well, this is the bad Tsar, we need new Tsar. So he's, Russian president is fully aware of this dynamic. There were many Tsars before him who ended up pretty badly by not delivering, and so he understands that. Now let's finish with the Zaporizhzhia front line. Things here are quite the same. Quiet, as I said, in terms of there's no any large-scale offensives. There's always low scale actions not going on non-stop everywhere on the front line. That's it for today. Thanks for watching, and until tomorrow. Bye bye.